Coming up, Norway has had a history of Christianity for 1,000 years. Today, are we seeing a tailspin into secularism and postmodernism, or the seeds of a biblical revival?
What I've found is that Norwegians are probably one of the most intelligent and well-read people groups that I've ever met. Typically, you won't find something that they haven't read on. And if you do, they're intellectually honest enough to say, yeah, we haven't really read up on that.
Nahum O'Brien and Edvard Moe talk apologetics, evangelism, and revival in Norway in 1 minute. But first, a word from ABWE President Paul Davis.
ABWE missionaries are coming beside the lost and the hurting around the world. And through the Global Gospel Fund, they're pulling people from the darkness and training them as leaders. They're planting churches, and they're even beginning their own missions movements. You may already support one ABWE missionary. Would you consider a gift to the Global Gospel Fund to support all 1,000 of our missionaries? Thank you for that.
Become a partner today at abwe.org/Global Gospel Fund. Welcome to the Missions Podcast, the show that explores your hard questions on missions, theology, and practice to help goers think and thinkers go. I'm Alex Kochman, Director of Advancement and Mobilization for ABWE International, joined again, as always, by Scott Dunford, West Coast Mobilizer with ABWE and lead church planter for Redeemer Church in Fremont, California. And Scott, I'm excited to dive into this topic here today. You know, sometimes when we get ready to record here, I do struggle a little bit because just for me personally, I'll admit, I look out on everything that's happening in our country. And for me, it's constantly this push to recognize and say, okay, the church may be struggling here. Christianity may be receding and in decline in the West in particular, and in North America, but you look out over much of the world and you see the Christian church exploding, especially in the global South. But what's interesting to me, and we'll dive into this today, is that God's working outside the U.S. In secular contexts too, in postmodern contexts, in places in Europe that you would assume would be even more hardened and bitter and resistant to the gospel than we are even here in North America, that God is still working in fantastic ways there as well. I don't know if you've ever had is it just me? Is it just me that has those thoughts sometimes, and surprised to learn that?
I don't know if it's just you. I think probably a lot of people are thinking that way. But I look at a place like where we're at in California and say, yeah, the church attendance has been on the decline. You see, a lot of empty church buildings or churches that are being sold. A lot of external things that are just disconcerting, but there's also within the middle of that, there's an incredible work of God, and God is doing works in people's hearts, and even using, what we've seen is even just using things like coronavirus and things like the protests to really cause people to really think about what matters. And when those moments happen, and they start really thinking and stop just putting in autopilot, they need the answers of the gospel. So I do think that we see some amazing things happening around the world, and it's going to take time for the fruit of that to be shown.
It will take time, and the fruit of that is happening, and God's using things even like viral YouTube videos to spark some of this, but I don't want to steal too much of the thunder of our two guests today. One, first joining us is Nahum O'Brien. Nahum is an ABWE missionary in Norway. Just hit 100% back in February, was it, Nahum? Just hit 100%. Nahum is a good friend, him and his wife, Erin, of me and my wife, Hannah. And Nahum, we even took classes together back in college and knew each other in those days, but I don't need to get into all of that. But we're excited to have you on, Nahum, as well. We're also joined by one of his Norwegian friends and partners in ministry, soon to be, Edvard Moe. And excited to have both of these gentlemen. Why don't you both introduce yourselves and fill in some of the details there? First, Nahum, and then Ed.
Sure. Yeah. My name is Nahum O'Brien. And as Alex said, we knew each other for a long time. Originally, I was from Southern Ohio. I am in a part of Ohio that borders Kentucky and West Virginia. And so we do, I'm not offended by the term hillbilly, as we would say we are one. But after high school, spent a few years in the military. After that, went straight to Liberty University and then the seminary afterwards. and soon after graduating seminary was joined by ABWE in partnership, and now being sent to Norway. Unfortunately, the virus had other plans about our expediency on how fast we get there. But about a few years ago, I was able to meet Edvard, and I'll introduce him now. He's a good friend of mine from Shilden, the church that we'll be serving with in Norway once we get our permits. And go ahead, Edvard.
Yeah, well, I'm the local Norwegian guy, I suppose. I pretty much started taking my faith seriously somewhere around my late teens, where God would work in my heart, especially actually through some very powerful preaching that I would find online. Guys like John Piper and things like that really helped me take my faith seriously and worked in me. And so later on, I met a wonderful woman who's now my wife, and she led me to move down to the Stavanger area where Nahum will be serving, and started studying theology there, and also started going to the church where Nahum will be serving. And I'm also one of the elders there now. So that's, I suppose, the short version.
Excellent. Well, our listeners won't know this, but when we record, we're in a platform on the computer. We can each see different names, and you can punch in a different screen name every time you log in to record. Well, my friend Scott here punched in the name Olaf for himself as we were coming into and I'll admit, and maybe most of our listeners are here with me, I immediately think Olaf the Snowman. I will be man enough to admit that on the Missions Podcast, my knowledge of Norway pretty much starts and ends with Arendelle, which I'm told is fictitious. Scott knows a little bit more. Apparently there's a Christian connection there with Olaf historically, and he can get into that because Norway does have a long history of Christianity, right, Scott?
It does. And honestly, the snowman didn't even cross my mind, but that probably says a lot to the ages of our children,
yes,
more than anything. But I wanted to ask you guys, and maybe Ed, you can go first, and Nahum can chime in from with an American perspective and just maybe a different angle. But Christianity has been in Norway for a long time. From what I was reading, it looks like the evangelization of Norway began around 1000 AD, and
wow.
And so it's been there for a very long time in some form or another. Obviously, King Olaf II is kind of credited with being the one to really bring Christianity, or at least a form of Christianity, and have it spread all over Norway. But can you tell us a little bit about that? So the question that people maybe think about, and Nahum, you've had to answer this probably 100 times, but Norway has a long history of Christianity. It has, a church that up until recently was a state church, that was there. Why in the world would we still send missionaries to Norway? Does Norway still need missionaries? Can you tell us a little bit about the history of Christianity in Norway and where it stands today?
Sure. So it's right, just the way you said it, that Norway had its exposure to Christianity essentially through the Vikings traveling and eventually stumbling upon Christians and bringing the faith back to the land they came from. And so from that, we had Catholicism in our country from around year 1000-ish. I'm not an expert on this, but these are general guidelines. And from there on, at that point, Norway was unified with Denmark, so it was the same country. And as the Reformation made its way to Denmark, it also kind of made its way, according to my understanding, rather seamlessly into Norway. So around 1600 or something. I might be off on the date exactly, but around there. And from there, we had a Lutheran state church. When Norway became independent, that became an independent Norwegian Lutheran state church, which has in many ways shaped our culture, our history, all the way up to today. So it's very commonplace for people to baptize their babies, but also at the same time, it bears with it maybe the possibility for people to think of the faith as something that you kind of have to do, because the way you got sort of written into the population statistics, so to speak, at least around the 1800s or whatever, was by being baptized. They'd write down the name and you'd be in the church books. That's how you'd know who were whose children, right? So Lutheranism is in many ways so deeply integrated into our culture, even as we have been becoming more secularized since World War II at least. Even then, it still has so many deep cultural reference points, so that it doesn't really go away. It just kind of has its secular shadow left.
Yeah, you mentioned naming and baptism, right? Obviously referring to the first name as one's Christian name, right? Because it's when you were christened, you were given that name. So it certainly feeds that nominal Christianity. But Nahum, I want to turn it to you. Yeah. I knew you before you were enlisted as a pre-field missionary, and we crossed paths again years later when I was coming on board with ABWE, and you were at that point working with ABWE, and you began to share with me then the story of revival breaking out, and started with a YouTube video I think a lot of us have seen. Tell that story and what's happening in the church in Norway now.
Yeah, so about 2005, I initially went to ABWE and started the process of becoming a worker with them. And I remember sitting in Dave Woodard's office, and I was asking him, I said, I think I'm geared towards Western Europe as far as a possible location to serve in. Where do you need the most missionaries? I just flat out asked him. And
Dave Woodard at the time, our executive director for Europe, is his position at the time. Yeah.
Yes. And he went through all the countries, and ABWE alone had at least 5 to 10 missionaries in every country in Western Europe that we have people. And he got to Norway, and it only had one at the time. And now, as far as I know, Aaron and I are the only ones that are going to Norway officially. I know we have a couple more that in their pipeline now in pre-field. But all that to say is that's really the decision that led me to choosing Norway, was that we needed people there as a mission board. When you expanded that, I found that there was only in conservative evangelical mission boards in the United States, there was only 4 missionaries in the entire country of Norway. But what really did it for me was the second survey trip I took to Norway, and actually meeting with the guys at Shielden. The 2 pastors there at the time were Martin Helvik and Asbjørn Berland, and meeting with them along with Bob Burns, and hearing about their heart for their own country. And that is really what convinced me to go. As far as statistics wise, what I read at the time in 2015, I had read that while, like Edvard said, there's a state church, which is now a national church, I believe. Maybe he could tell us a little more about that. But at the time.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, at the time, there was only I think about 75% of Norwegians were church members at the time in 2015, but only about 4% of Norwegians ever attended church. And so that was alarming to me, especially when the guys in Norway were telling me about how few truly biblical churches there were in Norway that were actually faithfully preaching the gospel.
So that makes me ask the question. So what happened? Because within Lutheranism, I mean, I have several Lutheran liturgy books, and I mean, you can read through them, and there's the gospel is explicit, even if the preaching is not explicit. Do you have an idea of what happened? What caused what caused the kind of secularization of Norway, despite the fact that they've had a gospel proclamation and access to the scriptures for a very long time?
And then what's happened recently that's changed that? I again remember the story of this video spreading, and that got some traction in the churches too.
Oh yeah, sorry, I forgot about the video you asked for. So I'll leave it to Edvard to talk about what happened as far as the secularization of Norway. I'm sure he'll be more familiar with that. I think we're experiencing it now in the United States, and we have been for many years. But as far as the video, so one of the things I noticed among the Norwegian brothers there was that they multiple of them came up to me and were telling me their testimony, and there was a kind of interesting commonality between them, and that was that they had watched a YouTube video from Paul Washer, the most shocking youth sermon ever, I think it's called, and a lot of them had really pointed back to that as a point in faith, as they watched that video, and it brought them to a true understanding of the gospel. And I thought that was very, very interesting. But what you have right now is a large group of, especially, I don't think I'd be amiss to say it, millennial, maybe generation, that is starting to recognize the true gospel. In fact, most of the people in Shieldon and in the network of churches that are kind of that we follow along with in Norway are all quite young, and they're all eager for the true gospel. And I don't know, Edvard, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think you're onto something there. The gospel is having its resurgence, I do think. It's wonderful to see. And I'm very encouraged by our churches. And as you say, they are quite young. I'm 25 myself, and I'd be, I don't know, maybe I'm the average, I suppose. Also, within the broader stream of Norwegian churches, there are many Lutheran organizations that have their own little prayer houses, which would be essentially sort of a soft version of church, where there's a sermon, there's some worship and music, and people gather. And there are also quite a lot of Pentecostal churches here. And what I've seen over just the last few years is a tendency to take intellectual issues of the faith more seriously, maybe in response to just realizing that the culture is no longer with us on these issues. I've seen what I think is a very encouraging revival of apologetics and serious thinkers, also among many of the more mainstream strands of Christian communities here in Norway.
Now, Scott and I were debating these stats, and maybe, Scott, you have an opinion on this too, but pulling up Joshua Project, with which many of our listeners will be familiar, they have Norway at about 8% evangelical. And when we talk about the need for missionaries, a lot of people talk about unreached people groups and places, and focus on, well, if you're below 2%, we really think that's the point at which the believers that are there just aren't going to be able to sufficiently evangelize their countrymen. So from a certain missiological perspective, people would look at Norway and say, hey, 8%, that's enough. I don't know. Anecdotally, and Scott, maybe you have different stats pulled up, but I'd also be curious to hear if these guys have an opinion of, is that accurate, 8%? And whether or not it's accurate, just anecdotally, does it feel like there's enough of a presence there, or do we still need missionaries there?
That's a hard question to answer, especially, being far from Norway at the time. From what I've heard from others, and I don't want to name names or anything like that, but from what I've read is that there's a large portion of Norwegians that would claim Christianity by name and by history, by culture even, but not many would, in a sense, be born again believers. And that would be true of any country, really. You could say that the United States as well. Even though we have an 8% evangelical rate, if you would, in Norway, it still doesn't neglect the fact that we need people in Norway, whether of Norwegian descent or whether of Western or wherever, that are willing to go with the gospel and be lights amongst the communities.
I could also add to that number that I would say my initial impression of the 8% number is that it does sound a bit fishy. Obviously, there's the question of how do you define evangelical, right? So they have taken all the non-Lutheran church communities and added up their members or something. That's possible. But you'd still be leaving out probably people who aren't really actually registered in a community, and you'd probably also be leaving out people who are within the Church of Norway but actually take the faith seriously and try to hold their place, so to speak, within that organization, even though they have embraced some strange theological positions over the years.
Well, we want to dive in a little bit more after this quick break and ask about the state of the church and what needs to happen in ministry to see it grow. But first, we're going to hear from some of our sponsors.
Hi, I'm Scott Dunford, and I would like to share with you about a new nonprofit ministry established to help churches, Christian schools, and other ministries protect children and prevent abuse. Rich Hamar from Church Law and Tax states that the number one reason that drives churches to court is child sexual abuse. I can't think of anything more devastating to these lives, their families, and our witness before a watching world than sexual abuse that takes place in ministry. The traumatic impact often leaves the vulnerable not wanting anything to do with God or His people. Furthermore, as ministry leaders, our efforts toward evangelism, discipleship, and spiritual formation are not only neutralized, but shattered. Evangelical Council for Abuse Prevention was formed last year to help ministry leaders understand the complexities of child protection and abuse prevention. They are establishing standards and an accreditation program that will help verify that appropriate measures are in place at your church or ministry. Learn more about them and their good work at abuseprevention.org. Find a helpful and free assessment tool to help you see how you measure up in this area. Go to abuseprevention.org and click on the link for this resource assessment. Evangelical Council for Abuse Prevention. Pray for them and follow along for this accreditation program coming soon.
Brooks Buser, president of Radius International.
I am here with Mark Dever, senior pastor at Capitol Hill Baptist and president of 9 Marks.
When you go to a culture that's a different language than yours, you're ending up in a kind of majority language that's been reached. And there are other peoples still more hidden, and it's those people who are often almost entirely unreached, and they take more cross-cultural effort. Is there a way we can better train people to have more realistic expectations of what life is like in the kind of 2 steps away from my culture, and be able to sustain family life with its normal difficulties there, so that there can be a long years and even decades long witness in that culture? And it seems like Radius is set up to provide that training. Radius is about reaching unreached people groups.
Go to radiusinternational.org, radiusinternational.org.
So Norway is a big country. It covers a lot of area on the map, and especially because it's so long, so to speak, from north to south. And when we think of Norway, those of us who are relatively uneducated about the country, I tend to think of these deep valleys or fjords, that are separated by mountains. Is in America, if the gospel was thriving maybe in California, it wouldn't necessarily be thriving in Maine. Is that the same case in Norway? Does Christianity spread from city to city, or is it relatively isolated within a geographic area?
I think in today's modern age, it's kind of difficult to have any geographical location be properly isolated, at least in the Western world with internet and all that stuff. But there are cultural tendencies in our country that have tended toward certain geographical locations having more of a density of seriously committed Christians as opposed to others. So that would be probably the more southern part of Norway and also the western part of Norway. But probably further up north, less so. In the east, you'd have Oslo, which is, I'd say, probably for the most part, quite a secular city. Even though there are big churches there as well. But it's a big city also, so you'd have a much larger population to draw members from, right? So, yeah.
So would it be uncommon to see church planting happen in Oslo and then make its way over to the west coast of Norway and then all the way up to the north in the Arctic Circle? Do people move frequently like that, or do they tend to stay home?
I think people probably move around for all sorts of reasons pertaining to work and studies and things like that. It does seem like many of the sort of larger independent church organizations have a commitment to have their sort of a representative church in the different cities, at least the major ones. So there's that. But my impression is that the further north you go, the fewer people want to plant, I suppose.
Well, that's fascinating, because within, some streams of Baptist life here in America, like for instance, with the Southern Baptist Convention, they had lots of church plants in the South. And yet when I was talking to some of the directors of church planting, especially in the northern states, part of the problem is that the Southern Christians, they'd come up to the north, get cold in the winter, not sure what to do and how to entertain themselves, for 6 months of the year. And then after a year, they'd quit and go home. And so as a result, you do see in North America, lots of churches in the South and relatively few churches in the North, or at least, less attended churches in the North. So it's interesting to kind of even compare, a very different place in Norway and see maybe some of the same types of things.
Yeah, I don't know what are the exact mechanisms of that, but obviously here, at least, there's a harsher climate up north, and it's quite large and quite a long distance between cities. So people also live quite spread out, and so that probably makes a difference also for churches too. It makes it perhaps difficult to find a good location to plant unless you're in some of the larger cities up there, because people would probably have to drive quite far to get there.
Well, speaking of coldness, we think about the work of evangelism, and I think that there is a connection between the literal physical climate of a region and the spiritual climate. I think there is a connection there that's not even entirely coincidental. But what does evangelism look like? I'd love both of you guys to speak to it, starting with Nahum and then Ed. But, as far as evangelism, I can see maybe some of the contrarian listeners, and we have a few, listening and thinking, okay, but there's a church there. There's missionary presence. Can't they continue the work of evangelism? What would be the role of a Westerner coming in and doing what potentially Norwegian believers themselves could be doing? So, Nahum, when you engage a Norwegian individual, or when you're about to engage one of those individuals in an evangelistic conversation, what does that look like? Are you able to build on a foundation, or are you really starting from absolutely, the ground up? There's no foundation there yet.
No, not at all. From what and again, my experiences of evangelizing Norwegians is very, very limited. Just confined to basically the 6 weeks that I've been there, and especially the 2 weeks that I was out east in Oslo and Trondheim and through that corridor there. But what I've found is that Norwegians are probably one of the most intelligent and well-read people groups that I've ever met. Typically, you won't find something that they haven't read on. And if you do, they're intellectually honest enough to say, yeah, we haven't really read up on that. And so when you approach them with the gospel, for instance, I was sitting down in a church in Trondheim with a self-professed atheist, and he was in a church. Yeah. He came to the church to meet with us just because it was the only place that I knew of to sit down. But he was 18 years old as an atheist, and he came and sat with me, and we talked for 2 nights in a row over tea and coffee, a total of about 12 hours. And I remember sitting there thinking, like, what 18-year-old in the States would sit down with you without a cell phone in their hands and talk to you for 12 hours. But generally, I think Norwegians are a bit more mature than the average American, especially if you compare age groups. But he was intellectually engaging the entire time. He knew facts about the Bible. Now, in my opinion, he knew them incorrectly or knew them inadequately, depending on the type of exposure that he had to the gospel there in Norway. For instance, he was living in some ways that he didn't know that the Bible has condemned, so on and so forth. And when it comes to the gospel, I explained the gospel to them at the end of our time together. And he sat back and he had acknowledged that there was some points that he had never heard before. But what was most striking to me was he sat back and he said, even if you could prove to me beyond a shadow of a doubt that what you're telling me is true, I still don't know if I'd be willing to accept it. And so it made the spiritual darkness of our minds and of our hearts all the more present to us. But when it comes to evangelizing, I from what I have seen in Norway, it seems to be a longer process. Norwegians seem to take a little longer in their decisions, decision making in general, but as well as regarding the gospel. What I have heard and what I have found by just talking to Norwegians is they tend to take months, sometimes even years, of processing the information, of processing the gospel before they'll actually commit. And I think that's wise. They don't jump in anything half-heartedly. But Edvard, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you. You're the knowledge expert on the matter.
I resonate with a lot of what you're saying, Nahum. My own experience with evangelism is very much with people my own age, so around mid-20s, 30s, and so on. I have been involved in apologetics on university campuses a bit and spoken to a lot of people in those types of environments. Obviously, there you would find people who are, I suppose, slightly more intelligent than average. But generally speaking, the objections to the faith are, I suppose, things that would be common in most Western countries. Things like Christian sexual ethic is very difficult for people to understand. Questions related to homosexuality, marriage before engaging in sex, and so on. And I think there's a real need for that in particular to be seen as rooted in God's good creation, his good intentions for humanity. And there's a real need for that to be explained as beautiful within the creator order of God. But also you'd have intellectual questions regarding the existence of God, claims about God being immoral in the Bible, and so on. And so you have all that new atheist type rhetoric. But I think the most challenging fundamental issue for at least people my age would be this idea that we have the right to construct our own destinies in life. There's this idea that we have fundamentally presupposes that we have no creator, right? And therefore we are, in a sense, free to create ourselves. And the ultimate expression of our particular individuality would be sort of to express our innermost feelings over and against what everyone else might think. And that is sort of seen as courageous, as heroic, and as sort of being true to yourself. I'm sure you have the same thing in the States. But that just fundamentally conflicts with a Christian theology of creation, where we are not just mere meat bags running around trying to discover our own destinies and purposes. We have been created for a glorious end of praising and worship God and being God's stewards here on earth and serving his creation and serving him ultimately. And within this broader context of a theology of creation, you find that the purposes for our lives is to live in accordance with what God has made, the way he has made us, and according to who he is. And so that really is the fundamental issue. That's what everything boils down to. We need to present a beautiful theology of creation, of God as a good creator who loves us, who wants the best for us, and who is not just out to get us all the time.
That was beautifully stated. And it makes me wonder, as you interact with people, is it only a secularism that you're running into, or in the States, I mean, we kind of see, at least we hear about, I don't know if I know a lot of people like this. I actually have a family member who thinks he's returning to Viking paganism, but is there any kind of resurgence of paganism, in Norway and maybe the rest of Scandinavia? You kind of see some of that. There's that movie Midsummer. I didn't see it, but it came out and it was very, it's pretty popular and kind of horrific. Is that resurgent at all in Norway or the rest of Scandinavia?
I haven't heard of that. Is that a movie about like Norse mythology?
Well, it's a movie. I don't want to promote it because from what I can read online, it sounds pretty horrific. But it's a movie about like cultic pagan practices, and it's kind of a horror movie of people go up to just celebrate something that they think is pretty innocent, and ends up being pretty horrible.
Okay, sure.
but it's popular,
Sure, yeah. Well, I'd say that I don't really think things like Norse mythology is kind of having its resurgence. Of course, there are a few of those out there who believe in things like that, and you would sometimes, I suppose, run into them, but it's not really a common thing. I think secularism is way more threatening, and also increasingly what we are discovering is that as we have had many immigrants from Islamic countries, we also have to learn how to evangelize to Muslims to a greater extent than before, especially also around young people. You have maybe second generation immigrants who have kind of been brought up with parts of Norwegian culture, but at the same time they have kind of basic Islamic perspective on life.
So you guys have the floor. You have the chance to speak to our whole audience. Describe what your ministry, for Nahum and Aaron as you arrive, and then Ed, for you personally, currently, what does your ministry look like? What are your focuses? How can people plug in? How can they pray for you? What do you need alongside of you? Do you need more people with this evangelistic apologist sort of bent, or do you need people to fill other roles on your team as well? So I'll just give the floor to you to talk about your needs and what the ministry is going to look like.
Yeah, so I'll go and then thank you. I'll go and then I'll leave Edvard to pick up where I left off, because he is doing a great job of covering for me in my ignorance. But yeah, so Aaron and I, we will plan on moving to Norway as soon as we get answers from our permits, which right now is obviously, for obvious reasons, is taking longer than normal. We got a letter from the immigration office the other day saying that they're still working on them, but we will be moving to Norway as soon as that happens. And I remember the first time we were in Norway, we sat down with the leaders there of the church, and I just expressed my heart. And my heart is that I don't want to come and plant Nahum's next church. I don't want to really plant an American church. I wanted to come and say, look, I want to serve with you all as Shieldon, and do whatever that you would ask of me to do. And in a sense, I consider myself almost a Barnabas to their Paul. I want to help establish Norwegian churches in whatever ways that they would desire. And so right now, we just, as far as prayers go, we could be, I'd ask the audience just to be praying for us as we're waiting. Waiting while you're raising support is hard, but waiting when you already have the support raised is even harder. And so now we're waiting here. We're fully funded. So far, none of the virus hasn't affected our support, which is a blessing. But just pray that we will be patient and that we will keep ourselves busy during this time that we have waiting. And then when we arrive in Norway, we'll immediately be jumping into a language school and getting involved in the various ministries that Shieldon has running there. And so I'm very excited for that.
So we're a church. We want to reach out to our local community. We want to reach out to the people in our area. There are a few guys at our church that have started a podcast, actually 2 different podcasts that have had some reach, which has also brought some other people to the church. So that's a bit of a blessing, and that's something
in
to
Norwegian?
pray for. Yes, sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah. Yes. Other than that, I sometimes go around speaking and attend apologetics events. That's also been a great blessing. And we're also just trying to stay faithful where we are with what God has given us at our church. serving the people who attend there, and trying to love our neighbors the best we can, and show them the gospel of the wonderful grace of God. So yeah, I think we're kind of in many ways doing normal church stuff.
Edvard, I have a question. If someone's listening to this and maybe their heart is being stirred toward Norway, what would you recommend to them as some first steps as far as what they could do to learn more about Norway, or even maybe consider coming to Norway? Is that even something you would desire for them? What kind of advice would you give to a young person listening in and going like, man, I my heart is burdened toward Norway?
Wow, that's interesting question. I'm not sure where you get really reliable information about our country, like from an American perspective. I suppose you'd get some decent information on Wikipedia, but also probably resources from the state would probably give you quite accurate information if you're just looking for basic information about our country. Visiting, go ahead. I'm biased, but I do think it's a beautiful country. We have very many. The fjords you mentioned are definitely real. I've been to several of them. It's very beautiful. But as far as feeling stirred for Norway, I'd be hoping that you'd have a heart for engaging the minds of secularized people, because that is fundamentally the major challenge here, as far as I'm aware. And apologetics can sometimes seem like a dry intellectual exercise, but when you're talking to someone who needs the gospel, when you're talking to someone who's depressed because they feel that life is utterly meaningless and nothing that they will ever do would ever satisfy them or whatever, then apologetics matter, theology matters, and I would really hope that people would, get familiar with a secularized worldview and realize the implications of the gospel, because it's not just a matter of is it true? Because as Nahum mentioned, the guy who he spoke to acknowledged that even if it was proven to him, he would not probably believe, right? So I think in so many ways, and I think this is a neglected theme in preaching in general, is presenting the gospel, presenting the Christian worldview, presenting the implications of the death and resurrection of Christ as beautiful for our lives. The implication of which is that your life is not meaningless. You're not just walking around here as a meaningless meat bag trying to procreate, right? You're made in this beautiful creation displaying the glory of God. That's entirely different. That changes everything. And if Christ has really been raised, those are the implications, right? And so just get a sense of the beauty of the gospel, get a sense of the beauty of God's creation, and get a sense of the beauty of the loving, caring restrictions God has placed on human life in order that we might function properly within his beautiful creation.
Yeah, serving in Norway, not for the faint of heart, and having a passion for doctrine, both in the head and also in the heart.
Yes.
And speaking of sound doctrine as well, Nahum, you have a podcast as well. Want to give you a chance to talk about that real quick as we close.
Oh, I appreciate that. Yes. During this time of waiting, and especially in conjunction with my Doctor of Ministry project that I have going on at this moment, which is essentially seeing the effects of taking your local church, your local congregation through the biblical principles of interpreting Scripture, and seeing how that affects not only your people's confidence in handling the Word of God, but also their competence, their ability to handle the Word of God. And so we're not wanting to let this research and work go to waste. In a sense, I wanted to really broaden it out. And so I decided to start a podcast, and it's called the Hermeneutics Podcast. and it's essentially just a podcast.
It seems a bit derivative.
Yes, it was. I'm very clever in my name originating, but it's essentially a podcast that through 10 to 15 minute bite-sized segments to teach through the principles of biblical interpretation, so that the layperson or even the pastor, I know that I've always been refreshed, even if I pick up a very a beginner level introductory to hermeneutics textbook. I'm always refreshed and edified by the content therein, just by refreshing it for myself. But it's designed to be able to teach in small segments, as well as doing interviews. My latest interview was with Dr. Tom Buck of the Southern Baptist, I guess, not convention, I guess, but he's a Southern Baptist pastor in Lindale, Texas. And we were talking about why we shouldn't interpret the scripture through cultural lenses. Something that you would think would be pretty obvious, but that you would want to interpret the text of scripture as they would have interpreted it, the original readers, from the original author's intent.
Right.
But stuff like that is not always obvious today. And so, just check me out. I'm on most major platforms, the Hermeneutics Podcast.
Very good. Well, thank you both gentlemen so much. And folks, be praying for them. If you want to get in touch with them, you can email alex@missionspodcast.com. We'll get you connected. We'll also provide some more links in the show notes that'll be helpful to you. Nahum and Ed, thank you so much. And God bless you both in your ministries.
God bless. Thank you.
Thank you.
To get more content, go to missionspodcast.com or check out abwe.org/podcast. If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share. To ask a question or suggest a topic, email alex@missionspodcast.com, and we'll see you next time on the Missions Podcast.